This is Top of Mind, the Dr. Patrick Slowinski Show.
Well, I wanted to welcome everybody to a show that we haven't had for a while. Top of Mind has had just a tiny little bit of a break. We have busy lives like all of our listeners and viewers. And so we've been away for a little bit, but producer Victor and I are committing to try to find more time to get some of these great guests on and talk about some really amazing things. And I'm really excited tonight to have a former diplomat colleague of mine who he and I did not get to work together while we were in the service, foreign service together. However, we become friends pretty quickly. And he has a lot to share in very many realms. I think academicians would call his life very eclectic. And I love that about Michael. And one of the things we're going to really talk about, which might surprise our listeners and viewers, is AI. And kind of a little in the weeds, just the mathematics behind it, which a lot of people don't think about. So we're really excited to have him here. So with that, I want to give you, Michael, a little bit of time to introduce yourself to our audience. What should they know about you besides being a highly decorated, esteemed diplomat, a student of political science for a long time, a Georgetown grad, a father of I'm going to mess this up. Which military academy was it?
West
Navy?
Point grad.
Oh, I got in big trouble by guessing Navy. No, but definitely a West Point grad and married to a diplomat as well, a U.S. diplomat.
That's
And they're still together, folks. So look, it can be done. You can be diplomats and stay together. So that's fantastic. So Michael, over to you to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'm going to talk to you about what's top of mind in America today, and then foreign policy, and then we'll get over to AI.
great. Well, yeah, I served 26 years in the U.S. State Department. Half of that time in the former Soviet Union, some of it actually in the Soviet Union itself, and then I spent many years in the former Soviet Union after the breakup of the Soviet Union in '91. And then after 9/11, I spent the balance of my career doing counterterrorism issues, mostly in Saudi Arabia, but also at U.S. Central Command. And I was in Iraq for 18 months at the beginning of the war there, working at the Coalition Provisional Authority. I've traveled and lived all over the Middle East ever since I started when I was 16. I was studying Arabic in Cairo under the Fulbright program, but so I had many, many decades and lived and traveled all over the Arab world, all the way from Morocco to Iraq. So, and from the West Bank to Yemen. So that is an area of the world I know. And then when I joined the State Department, I taught myself Russian, was taught Polish by the State Department, ended up spending half of my career in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, mostly in Warsaw, Moscow, Chisinau, Moldova, and Yerevan, Armenia.
Tell us a little bit about your connection with Armenia in particular. I noticed that you've done quite a bit with that. What has been the attraction for you with Armenia, and maybe something our viewers don't know about the country?
Well, Armenia, it turns out, is one of the, like Ethiopia, it's one of the source countries for human civilization and for humanity per se. It's just like Ethiopia, human evolution took place in Armenia over millions of years. And we know this because after I finished serving in Armenia, I established a archaeological foundation. We did both archaeological work and paleontology. And the oldest sites we found are very similar to the Olduvai Gorge site in East Africa. We found stone tools identical to what Leakey found at Olduvai. And they're at least 1.9 million years old. Our results track of what archaeologists and paleontologists have found in the neighboring country of Georgia. So it's pretty clear that the Southern Caucasus and Eastern Turkey, probably Northern Iran as well, are another one of those hotspots where the human race evolved very early on, much like East Africa. But we've
And
done a lot of work in Armenia besides that. We covered about 2 million years of history. We did a lot of work, all through that vast period, but a lot of our more interesting work involved the Copper Age and the Bronze Age. We discovered over 200 Bronze Age royal tombs and excavated them. We discovered two ancient cities and a previously unknown civilization in the Irony One cave in Armenia, which included the world's oldest known winery. So we doubled the age of wine. It had been thought that wine emerged around 3,000 years ago. We proved that it was that winemaking had become highly developed actually by 6,000 years ago. Now, the neighboring country of Georgia claims that it's the true homeland of wine. Obviously, these rivalries don't mean anything scientifically because Georgia and Armenia are relatively modern concepts. But there was no state border 6,000 years ago, at least nothing like the current one. But what's been found in Georgia so far are pottery fragments that look like they once held grapes. What we found in Armenia is a complete winery, a complete installation for making several hundred gallons of wine at a time. And we actually reverse engineered it and recreated the ancient wines, after many years of experimentation. So that was a big thrill.
So, in addition to Armenia, and I know your wife as well, who served as an ambassador in Kyrgyzstan, you both Russian speakers, and you spend that time in the Eastern Bloc, but also in my beloved Poland.
Yes.
So, tell us a little bit about your experience in Poland and where you see. I don't know if you're following Polish politics right now, but any thoughts on what's going on in Central Europe, maybe writ large?
Well, I just saw that the new Polish president had a great meeting with President Trump at the White House, so that's always good to see. In
Yeah,
Poland,
President Trump thought he said his name correctly. He wasn't even close, but everybody took it. Well, he tried. It's just hard if you don't grow up around it. It's Nawrocki and
right,
kind of in the States and it's not President Trump's fault by any means. Any CKI is like a like a key, right? So
right.
he became Naraki, I think, for
No, Rocky, yeah. Well,
Navraki.
that's phonetically, if you're an
And
American,
phonetically, it's fine. And I just you could see the relationship that those two really do like each other. And I have a sense, having followed Polish politics, and we did a show on this where we had some other experts come in on Poland, and President Trump inviting Nawrocki to Karol Nawrocki, the new president of Poland, to the White House before the election. Um, that was a big deal. And
yeah,
and clearly in Poland, you can legally you can vote even if you're living overseas, as long as you have a passport and proof of citizenship. You can find a consulate. You can go vote in the Polish elections, even if you're not in Poland.
that's
And so
good.
people do that. And when they looked at the results, there were a lot of people who voted for Nawrocki who were overseas. So who knows if that influenced it or not, but clearly those two have a lot to talk about. Poland is a key player in that neighborhood with that war between Ukraine and Russia. I know you also have lots of experience with Russia. Um, we just saw. I don't know if you heard about the hot mic between President Xi and President Putin talking about wishing they could live for 150 years. For someone who's followed Central Asia, but they've been talking about cryogenics for years.
Right.
Uh, trying to get these people who don't shy away from power. Let's say that
Right.
they definitely are. That's been a thing to try to freeze yourself, and then when the science gets better and the medications get better, and there are no more diseases, then you just come. They wake you up and you come back. Um, but that joke aside, and that kind of kidding aside, what is going on with the U.S. relationship with Russia? We'll start with Russia.
Well, I mean, I credit President Trump with pretty much taking off the table the possibility of the Ukraine crisis turning into a new world war. I think we are getting very close to that stage, unfortunately, in the Biden administration. I have to say I was very worried that our clumsy ham-fisted diplomacy during the Biden period was going to blunder us right into a nuclear confrontation with Russia. Um, During my State Department career, one of the things I spent many years working on was nuclear weapons issues, and it's interesting when you look at the current arsenals of the United States, especially the Russian Federation. Their arsenal isn't much smaller than it was during Soviet times. The weapons are just bigger, there are fewer of them, and they're much more accurate. The circular area probability is way down from what it was during Soviet times. The Soviets were lucky if they're going to hit the broadside of a barn. The Russian weapons are extremely accurate. One Sarmat missile, which is the latest heavy ICBM the Russians are producing now under Putin, he started the program 10 years ago, and now the missiles are being deployed. One of those is equivalent to 600 Hiroshima bombs, and they're planning to build 48. So I don't know that, nuclear disarmament has actually ever occurred. All the disarmament process really did was to change the shape of the arsenal somewhat. Um, and now, of course, most of the old nuclear treaties are inactive between us and the Russians. I think it's time for a revival of the Cold War era process of arms control negotiations. At the very least, we need much better monitoring of each other's arsenals. I'm worried about the U.S. nuclear arsenal in this context as well, because we don't do anything like the testing that the Russians do. Our Minuteman missiles were commissioned, the last of them were commissioned when I was a sophomore in high school. That was a long time ago, 73. They're now 50 years old and need to be replaced. So far, not a single one has been, because the technical skills that we need to do that sort of thing have been eroded because of the failed economic policies of the last couple of administrations that allowed our technical edge to erode. So we need to revive our nuclear deterrent in order to maintain structural stability in the world, strategic stability. Right now, it's eroding.
Well, and it's getting that gap, if you will, that vacuum, if you will, is getting filled by this weird axis that we always thought might happen, and we didn't want it to with Iran and a weakened Iran, but nonetheless in Iran, Russia, and China, and if you throw North Korea in there, you've got a quadruple of.
Well, I don't know if you read Anne Applebaum's book, Nuclear War, but to anyone who worked in the field, it's really amazing. Her ability to integrate information and talk to literally hundreds of people involved in the decision chain in the event of a nuclear crisis is astonishing. I take my hat off to her. Normally I don't have much time for mainstream journalists, but she is a real expert when it comes to nuclear matters. And in fact, the North Koreans are at a point right now where they could easily trigger a global nuclear conflict, even though their deterrent is vastly inferior to ours. It doesn't take much, because we only have 41 interceptor missiles. They're all on the West Coast, and they have an accuracy rate of only about 45%. So we really don't have much of a shield. We have a very aged land-based deterrent. Our nuclear submarine fleet, by the way, is due for replacement as well. And there, too, we're looking at huge backlogs and delays. So I think one of the things we need to do is, avoid a nuclear conflict now, which we would lose. And we'll probably spell the end of human civilization in general. There would be no winners. We certainly wouldn't prevail. And we need to modernize that deterrent, because it's becoming less and less of a credible deterrent. I know it sounds like a bad news Nelly here, but at the end of the day, I do care a lot about national security. I just wanted to make that point.
And it's a very lucid point with a lot of details. When President talks about he's seen the things and the powers that are out there, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about nuclear capabilities. He gets briefed all the time. He knows who's powerful, who has what, and what would happen, regardless of who starts it. And so he's doing everything he can, I think, to avoid that. And I think he's reached a fairly good balance. Alaska was an interesting example of showmanship in a sense, or even gamesmanship, however you want to define it, where he did roll out the red carpet, but then a B-2 flew over his head, right? And so I think there is that going on, that the carrot and sticks at the same time. So you have, a weird kind of carrot cake.
And AI can play a big part in strengthening our deterrent, both in defensive terms and offensive terms. There's no question that in the future, what we're going to need to counter this hypersonic threat that we're seeing increasingly appearing now in the hands of the Chinese and the Russians, but also disturbingly in the hands of the Iranians, to a lesser extent, but they're working on it. In order to counter hypersonic delivery vehicles for nuclear and conventional warheads, we're going to need AI-directed energy beam systems. Ballistic trajectories are not going to cut it anymore. This is not 1981 and Reagan's Star Wars vision is correct vision, but the technology has completely changed. And so we're going to have to look at powerful lasers directed by AI to counter these threats. Nothing else is fast enough to do it, not at Mach 27.
No, and that's a brilliant segue into our topic. And you are a successful author, and one of the books that you have out right now is on AI. And I want you to give you a second to plug your book, and then also talk to us about the misconceptions that are out there, and actually how AI could be actually become more powerful, and how we're clearly not using all of the tools out there to bring it to a different level, and then also the moral aspects and uh, the fears, may be well founded or not, that people have about AI. So why don't you tell us about your book, Michael, and then let's have that brilliant discussion about mathematics and AI.
Thank you. Yeah, I just published a new book, kind of a departure for me. I've written a number of books, but always about archaeology and about art and architecture, which are some of my passions. But so is mathematics. And over the last 10, 12 years, I've developed an increasing fascination with AI. And I'm particularly interested in the mathematical and philosophical roots of AI. I had a wonderful mathematics professor who had been part of the team that developed the U.S. nuclear weapon during World War II. And he had a saying he used to tell us all the time in college. He would say, uh, complexity is for idiots. Um, True scholars think deeply about simple things. And when we were studying mathematics, he said, never memorize formulae. That will not get you anywhere. If you really understand the basic principles, you can always derive whatever formula you need. And he would do it. He would get up there on the board, and start with the Pythagorean theorem and end up with the Lorentz Fitzgerald transformation, which is at the heart of special relativity after about 50 moves on the chalkboard. The guy was close to 100 years old when I was studying under him, but he was as sharp as ever. And sometimes he would speak extemporaneously in Latin because he was from Eastern Europe, and he had gone to school the old way. But yeah, my interest in mathematics and my involvement in the AI industry. I'm on the board of directors of a AI company called Potential Analytics that does medical AI. Got me thinking about the mathematical underpinnings of the artificial neural networks which run our AI systems, including the large language models like ChatGPT and Grok, which is my favorite. Don't own any Grok stock. I'm just saying it's my favorite. Um, and these engines are marvels. They can do things we couldn't have dreamed of. Yet they are very limited in terms of the mathematics that underpins them. When you look at the innards or lift the hood and look at what's under the hood, what you see is statistical engines like Grok and ChatGPT, which answer your question by literally combing through the entire internet and using statistical formulae to figure out what the most likely correct answer to your question is. And they go letter by letter. They do this by taking your question and breaking it down into tokens, which are mathematical objects that they vectorize or transform into vectors. They create abstract vector spaces and do calculations based on vector algebra and calculus using the laws of probability, and they come up with the best guess of what the next letter in the word they're writing should be in response to your question. This is a long way away from human consciousness. I must say that, to quote Noam Chomsky, whom I disagree with on politics but agree with on linguistics and philosophy, he's a brilliant philosopher. This has nothing to do with human cognition. Your brain, my brain, everyone's brain runs on 12 to 20 watts of energy. Elon Musk's server farms and vast computational arrays run on thousands, hundreds of thousands of watts. You can compute, and so can I, very accurately based on very sparse data. That's what the human brain does. It takes in sparse data and reasons brilliantly. Grok and ChatGPT take in oceans of data and reason very quickly, but very narrowly. And they're not aware that they're doing it, and they're not actually aware of the subject that they're discussing because they're statistical engines. That's one problem with them. The other problem is that the vector spaces that they create to do these calculations with their matrices and their vector calculus are essentially Euclidean in nature. So that's the high school algebra geometry we all learned. It's the geometry in which the sum of the internal angles of any triangle is 180 degrees, and a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, the Pythagorean theorem. So this geometry is a limited case, a very narrow slice of the real geometry of nature, which is actually something called Riemannian geometry. Riemannian geometry was developed in 1854 by Dr. Riemann, who was a disciple of the German mathematician Gauss. And it's a geometry of curvature. It's a geometry that assumes that the fundamental aspect of the world is curvature. Einstein borrowed Riemann's geometry in 1915 when he needed a mathematical framework for his theory of general relativity. Einstein there's a great quote from Einstein. He was writing to a student who said, "I have such difficulty with your mathematics." And Einstein said, "Don't worry, my difficulties are worse than yours." But he knew where to turn. Einstein was a brilliant borrower, and he borrowed from Riemann. And so Riemannian geometry is the fundamental geometry that underpins physical reality. And it compares to Euclidean geometry the way a Stradivarius compares to a ukulele. They both have strings, but that's where the resemblance ends. Riemannian geometry is this analytical instrument of tremendous power and flexibility. And so I began to ask friends in AI, why don't we model our artificial neural networks on this geometry, which is much more capable? And they
Let's
said,
take a step back.
just
Sorry to
don't do
interrupt,
that.
Michael, but just for our viewers and our listeners who don't know this. So one of the things that people are always concerned about is the the ability for AI to develop human traits in cognitive and even emotional affective states eventually. Um, and you're talking about what's very important is that those neural networks that you would need for that to happen don't exist now. It's based on Euclidean geometry is an underpinning of it. And you even mentioned how Grok and the others, they just process. They're not understanding, and they're just processing. They don't know the
They're
concept.
statistical engines. They're guessing.
And they do a great job. And but you're talking about a whole, not just curvature in terms of geometry, but a curvature in sense of the way we look at AI in a completely different way,
That's
where
right.
perhaps if we reverse engineered the AI, we could have AI that really analyzes analytically and has thought. Is that possible?
Yes, I think it is. If you build new artificial neural networks based on Riemannian geometry, which should have a completely different design than we're using right now, because they would construct um, virtually, in a virtual sense, curved mathematical spaces called manifolds, Riemannian manifolds. And these Riemannian manifolds would then incorporate data as individual points on the surface of the manifold. And connections between the data would take, the form of what's called the geodesic. A geodesic is the shortest distance between 2 points on a non-flat surface, on a curved surface. So this is how you form the heart of a new form of artificial neural network, artificial intelligence. And the thing about this type of model is you could integrate into it other types of AI, such as natural language processing, machine learning, most important, and then, of course, game theory for strategic reasoning. And the result, the inputs of these various modules become data points on your Riemannian manifold, which would then calculate based upon geodesics drawn on the manifold. So what would such a mathematical structure do? This type of AI would understand causality. Grok doesn't understand causality. Grok does not know that when you light up a match under a piece of wood, it is the flame that causes the wood to burn. It associates flame with burning, but it doesn't know that there's a causal relationship. And this leads to an interesting problem in AI called the frame problem. Because our current AIs cannot understand causality, they make hilarious mistakes all the time that have to be corrected.
The hallucinations, right?
Programming. Right. So if you want an artificial general intelligence, what you need is a machine that can understand causality. And I think Riemannian manifolds will give us this. If you add another technology, which is quantum computing, which involves two aspects of quantum field theory called entanglement and superposition, then you would get the calculation speed necessary, but also the relational capacity to really begin to rival human intelligence. I mean, you get up in the morning and you can think of at least 10 different things at the same time. You wake up and you're thinking, what will I have for breakfast? You know, when do I go to work? When do I grade those papers? You know, did I put gas in the car? All this is happening at the same time. Grok cannot do that. You can only think of one thing at a time for you. Now, your brain can do that, and it's because your brain is practicing a form of superposition. So quantum superposition would allow radically redesigned AIs to do this, and the Riemannian manifold would integrate all the data from the quantum computations into a correlated whole. So you'd have a machine that could, like you do, calculate many things at once, and understand causality, and do this with perfect memory and at very high speed. So that would become a true artificial general intelligence.
Amazing. And I guess the obvious question then is, if this geometry exists and there's investors out there and there's people that have thought about AI, how come they haven't looked at or moved to a system that it employs it's a
Riemannian.
Riemannian geometry instead of Euclidean geometry? Why hasn't that happened yet?
Stovepiping. So why is technical progress slower now than it used to be? Why is scientific progress slower than it used to be? Most people would say it's not. Look, I have the new iPhone. Well, I would say the iPhone's been around for 15 years now. Why don't we have the next thing after the iPhone? It's because of stovepiping. Back in the day, we had specialists, but they were more broadly trained than they are now, and they were encouraged to understand other fields of knowledge other than their specialty. So Professor Ross, the gentleman I was talking to earlier, who worked with Oppenheimer, on the Manhattan Project, um, his passion was classics. He could quote classic poetry in Greek and Latin for hours, but he was a brilliant mathematician and physicist. So he was an interdisciplinary thinker. These days, the academic disciplines are stovepiped. So when I go to my friends who are distinguished professors of computer science, and I say, what about using Riemannian geometry and artificial neural networks? Literally, one of the top researchers in the country told me recently, I don't know anything about Riemannian geometry. I've
Yeah.
never studied it, and it has nothing to do with our science anyway. So obviously, what we need is more interfertilization between the various specialties. We need the mathematicians and the computer scientists and the physicists to start talking to each other, because science is one. And that's something I try to point out in the book. Philosophy is the mother of mathematics. Mathematics is the mother of artificial intelligence. We need to get back to that, original spirit of science, scientific inquiry as a philosophical pursuit if we're really going to master AI. And then when we mastered AI, yes, there are huge risks to doing that. Yes, we could all be destroyed by, artificial superintelligences run amok. But we focus too much on that danger and not enough on the opportunity. And I think we miss rather obvious ways to limit, if not eliminate, that danger completely. So I'm not a technophobe. I'm not a techno pessimist. I see the dangers, but I think we can handle them. And happy to discuss that too.
Well, and being a host, I need to have you just tell us the name of your book a couple of times, and then we're going to go ahead and
Okay.
post it on all of our social media sites with a link so that people can go by. Just go ahead and tell us the title of your book.
The
I want to
title of
make
the
sure.
book is called Consciousness is Curvature. It sounds crazy, right? But the idea I have, and believe it's interesting. I only came to this idea after having written the book and considered the problem of consciousness pretty exhaustively from the perspective of AI. But I really do now think that, and it's a hypothesis, all right, not a proven fact, but my hypothesis is that consciousness is a kind of arises from intrinsic mathematical curvature in the process of thought. So consciousness arises from the Riemannian geometry of thought. That is my basic idea, and it also arises from two fundamental aspects of quantum field theory: quantum entanglement and quantum superposition. I think those three things together, Riemannian curvature, superposition, and entanglement, account for the fact that our brains are conscious.
So you and I were talking before, and I'm a big Isaac Asimov fan as well. I read the original in Russian, Ya Robot, or I Robot,
That's great.
and I'm able to read Russian. I don't know how it helps me today, but I'm definitely glad that I could do that. And he came up with three rules for the robots. Let's talk a little bit about that. But before you talk about that and how you've been also thinking about how you would govern an AI that could be more sentient, that could have an affective state. So as a student and a teacher of psychology, I'm always interested in behavior and affect, right? And so many people don't know what affect is. It's just basically your feelings, your affective state, your ability to feel something that you can't really. And other scientists would say, well, you're not really feeling. Those are physiological things that are happening to you. But I, as a psychologist, I'm going to say that we'll put them together as feelings. emotions that you feel for different reasons. And that means that the AI had an affective state, then could it make decisions based on feelings?
Well, one of the chapters in the book discusses whether or not advanced artificial intelligence would ever be capable of feeling love, uh, in the sense of agape, not eros,
Right.
obviously, because they're not biological entities. But my conclusion is yes. My tentative conclusion is yes. They would be able to do so. Um, Now, you get to the whole issue of qualia, which you are very familiar with. So I believe that using the approach I've outlined and properly integrating other aspects of AI into the overall system built like we've been discussing, you would be able to eventually to create artificial superintelligences that would be conscious and would be capable of sentiment. Um, so my answer to that one is a tentative yes. But the most one can say is they would display all of the outward signs of a feeling, an emotion like uh, an elevated sense of love toward humanity, if you built the engine the right way. Um, what their internal experience would be is something else again. And there may be no way of actually measuring that. We wouldn't be able to really measure their qualia. So with an extremely benevolent artificial intelligence that was, working very hard to deal with some crisis affecting humanity and appearing very compassionate in the process. Would it actually feel compassion? We may never know that. But it may be that from an external point of view, it wouldn't matter because it would act compassionately.
So when we started having a couple years back where AI really started coming to the forefront of people's individual lives, not just things they read about, and they were actually able to turn on their computer and have AI help them with something or chat GPT, whatever it may be. Immediately people started the doom and gloom about, well, um, they're going to see that AI is going to be able to rationalize and judge eventually and see that humans are horrible creatures. They're selfish, they're greedy, they don't adhere to certain rules. And I want to get back to the Isaac Asimov and his three rules for his robots. But basically, I want to turn the question to you is, should there be regulation of AI if what you say is true? And we could have in, I don't know how many years it would take for people to make the switch and change AI to something that was closer to sentient. Um, what kind of regulation could be out there, and would we really need it?
Well, we need to engineer these things in such a way that they won't harm us. And there's nothing radical in doing that. Um, we need to regulate this technology as much as we needed to regulate nuclear technology. It's a potentially lethal technology, just like nuclear power. Um, you can blow up a nuclear power plant and kill millions of people, poison a huge portion of the earth. That hasn't happened, thank God, because we have strict regulation, and not just in terms of law books, but physical measures are taken to make sure the systems don't fail. So Chernobyl stands out as a glaring example of where that didn't work. Um, but again, it wasn't for lack of trying. So we've done a pretty good job, better than people thought we would back in the 50s, in managing nuclear technology. And we also we need to do this again, like we were saying earlier. We had a great system of arms control agreements that prevent nuclear war, reduce the likelihood thereof. So we've shown that as a species, we're just about mature enough to develop these potentially lethal technologies without actually killing all of us. But AI, I think, is about as dangerous as nuclear weapons. And so it'll take regulation and it'll take internal engineering. I think the best way to go is to look at Asimov's three laws of robotics, rechristen them the three laws of AI, because what is AI other than a robot that exists in the form of software? And of course, now robots like Optimus are all going to be based on AI. So you're talking about two sides of the same coin. But Asimov's laws, as you know, are law number one is a robot may um, do no harm to a human being, right? May not harm humanity. The second law is a robot must obey any order given to it by a human being unless this violates the first law. So you cannot say to your Optimus, shoot my wife. The robot is supposed to say no. And the third law is the robot must preserve its own agency, its own ability to function, and its own physical existence, unless this violates the first two laws. these are really good foundational principles that we should start incorporating into our advanced AI models, our AGIs and ASIs, as we develop them. Because using the approach I've outlined in my book, we will be able to do this, and it won't be that expensive. I actually came up with a cost estimate based on what I know about the industry. So if you made a moderately intense effort to develop an AGI, you could do it in about 5 years for between 80 to $160 million. And most of that is personnel costs. Because what we're talking about is mathematicians and programmers. Um, some new hardware would be required. Mostly, it'd be more required if you want to go quantum, which would be ultimately necessary for more advanced models. But quantum engineering is expanding rapidly, so this will be doable soon. And if you wanted to create uh, a proof of principle model, you could do that in a year or two for under $1 million using off-the-shelf software and hardware now. It would not be a fully operational AGI, but it would be a proof of concept. So this is all doable. And I hope that the book sells and people get the idea and try this. It'll take a variety of skills. Um, I'm simply proposing a different way forward, but it'll take someone like an Elon Musk to come forward and decide this is worth looking at.
Fantastic, Michael. I'm sure some of our listeners are freaking out a little bit, or our viewers about how close we are to an AI that could do a lot more than it's already doing now. As an academician, as a instructor, as a faculty member, we constantly are struggling with the idea of humans, relying on AI to do everything for them and not being able to think for themselves. Is that a potential danger that you see? Is that as the AI intelligence increases in its ability to become more part of our lives and we let it do more things for us, that we actually reduce our intelligence and our ability to actually critically think? Because
Yes,
that's a hypothesis that's out there that I, as a psychologist, think there's a lot to.
yeah, I agree with you. I think it could happen. It's very important to regulate how we use these things. We can use them to increase our productivity enormously. We can use them to increase living standards exponentially. We can also use them as teaching aids. I mean, AI could be used to give every student on the face of the earth a brilliant professor who intuitively understands his or her strengths and weaknesses as a learner, as a student. Um, so it would be possible to devise a personalized system of educational instruction using advanced AIs that would help every student on the planet to achieve, every man a genius. Think of it that way. You really could get much, much further. I also think, because I'm very interested in the whole issue of consciousness and human mental development, I think that all of us contain or possess mental abilities that are poorly understood and weakly developed. And one of the things AI could help us do is better understand the capacity of our own intelligence, because I think right now, there's this old saying that we only use 10% of our brains. That, of course, is not true. All the areas in your brain light up all the time. But intensity of utilization is fairly low most of the time. And there's no question but that we have these magnificent mental instruments that we don't really fully use. And I think AI could help us understand how to develop our own awareness and intelligence. We're just at the beginning of all this. I think what's happening right now with AI is about as important to technological development as the invention of writing. I think this is leading to a fundamentally new type of civilization, like the invention of writing did. And I don't know about you, but I'm old enough to remember the invention of writing. So it's just,
I'm right behind you. It's sad though, as an educator, that so many schools have stopped teaching handwriting, and I think that's a lot. That's become a lost art, and it's very sad. Now AI can do beautiful handwriting now based on your personality and your background, but I would like it to be one zone, so to speak.
right.
Michael, just a fabulous discussion. The book again is Consciousness of Curvature.
Consciousness is curvature.
Consciousness is Curvature, and we encourage you all to go out and get that book. It's a very easy read, I'm sure. you I'm sure it's not dense at all. I'm kidding. It's mathematics, which for many of us is a challenge. But Michael, before we close, I just want to ask you the question I've been asking many of our guests on the show. Um, it's not on the topic of AI, but it's clearly on my top of my mind is the principle of strength through peace through strength. Now, we started with Ronald Reagan. Now we have President Trump. Do you think it's even possible to have any more peace through strength, or do most of the strong men that are out there not really want peace?
I think that it is possible to have to implement President Trump's vision of peace through strength. I think certain concrete things need to be done to make that happen, and most of them don't have to do with the military. We have to re-onshore our engineering and industrial manufacturing capacity. We need a foreign policy that puts American workers first. We need a national renaissance of vocational training. We need, right now we lack the skilled machinists and electricians we need to build nuclear submarines, for example. We need to relearn these skills. In World War II, we were turning out a major combat vessel every day. We can't do that any longer. So before we talk about having a huge military again, we have to have the manufacturing capacity to make that happen. And why not leap past the old technologies and use the modern, manufacturing technologies that are being developed in the heartland, in places like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Youngstown, Ohio, which are witnessing an industrial renaissance. And boom, Trump gets this. That's why he went to Tuscaloosa to deliver his, university address last May. He understands that the future of the economy of the United States is really not on the coasts; it's in the Midwest and the South. I think if he just gets out of the way of these American entrepreneurs and maybe adjusts taxes a bit lower, we'll see a tremendous renaissance. But if we have an industrial renaissance, then we'll have a military renaissance, and we can fulfill the vision of George Washington, really, which is not to be a country that goes to war at the drop of a hat, but to be a country that's an example for the rest of the world. And I saw that in my diplomatic career. So many people would say to me, especially in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism, they said, we admire about you is your institutions, especially your constitution. You flourish because of them, and we would like to emulate them. That is the greatest kind of power. And having served in a couple of wars, it's vastly more lasting and effective than military power. Not to denigrate the military, we need the sword and the shield. But we need really to lead by example, and for that we need a national domestic renaissance, which I think is what the president's trying for.
Well, I agree with you fully that President Trump is making the effort. He's clearly putting the effort in to achieve peace. And as somebody who has children, as somebody who has been in war zones like you have, heaven knows that I think the majority of the world would prefer to have peace.
Absolutely.
So we pray for President Trump and all of those people who are trying to actually be peacemakers, as St. Francis of Assisi talked about.
Yep.
So with that, Michael, I want to thank you again. It's been our privilege to have Michael Gfoeller, a former senior diplomat at the U.S. Department of State. He served all over the world, in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and around. It knows a lot. He doesn't just sit home after retirement. He's also a practicing Riemannian geometry mathematician. And please get out and get his book. And that is Consciousness is Curvature. And so please go out and get his book. And Michael, we're going to have you back again soon. Thank you so much for being on top of mind.
Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
In a world full of noise, clarity is power. Stay informed. Stay aware. Stay top of mind.